Welcome back to your Heat Latest on FanArc. I'm Sam Shapiro. If you haven't checked out Kalshi yet, well, they're sponsoring today's video, and you can actually use our promo code right here to go ahead and get started with them. Use our code FanArcBasketball to get $10 when you trade 10. Big shout out to them. Thank you for sponsoring this Thursday's video. We've got a lot to talk about surrounding a potential superstar with an insect-related nickname that could potentially be monitored by Miami this summer for a trade. Anyway, we're going to dive into that and more here. Jake Fisher talking about Miami Heat trade rumors earlier this week. He had talked about first he talked about how Miami is sick of the play-in. It's like, yeah, obviously, you and every other Miami Heat fan. Not to say that he is a Heat fan, but case in point, he also talked about how the Celtics are not serious suitors for Giannis Antetokounmpo. Loved hearing that. Did not love hearing as much that Golden State is interested in pursuing Kawhi, though, because could be a very attractive place for him to go, staying in California. Could maybe have some sort of last dance type of last-ditch effort with Curry to maybe bring in a title, but I don't know how well the two of them would do being in the Western Conference right now. The big thing that came out of these talks, or this line of dialogue rather, from Jake Fisher, was seeing that the Heat have been connected to Donovan Mitchell. And it was interesting to hear what he had to say about that specifically. He said, if the Cavs end up losing, what's going to happen with Donovan Mitchell? If he declines the extension with Cleveland, they almost have to look at trading Donovan, and Miami is very much going to be looking at acquiring him. Now, to me, this kind of sounds like the same old song and dance we hear every time a superstar may or may not be on the chopping block. Oh, Miami could be an attractive place for them to go. Da, 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 da. But, I mean, if I'm Miami and there is a scenario where Donovan Mitchell could potentially come to the 305, I think that's a great ad for their backcourt especially. When you think about the relationship that we're going to get into his stats and how great of an offensive player he is later in this episode, but I want to touch on first having a previous relationship with Dwayne Wade back in Utah. The guy's been friends with Bam Adebayo for years. That chemistry on the court between Bam and Donovan, the two extremes of an offensive firepower in Mitchell and a defensive beast in Bam Adebayo, I think would just make for the greatest two-way recipe Miami has seen in a long time. And I think it would also be a major upgrade from Tyler Hero, assuming that he would be at the center of a trade package involving him, or Norman Powell. I don't necessarily think that Norman Powell would be the player to trade in that deal, but depending on how his contract kind of looks, if you ultimately risk Powell walking and you know for sure that you can get some sort of deal with Hero done, then I think you trade Hero instead. But anyway, a lot to dive into in terms of how it would be potentially an upgrade for Miami in a number of areas. I'm going to dive into that in this next segment here. But before we do that, just going to give a shout out here to the sponsor of today's video, that being Kalshi. Now, the playoffs are here, and it's the most electric time in basketball. On Kalshi, you can trade every single playoff game, every series, the conference finals, and the championship. So I'm going to take a dive here into the Spurs and Minnesota, the series between the Timberwolves and the Spurs, the Spurs look to close out the series tonight with a Game 6 win. They're up 3-2, obviously, and they've got a fairly better chance at this point right now to ultimately win the series, sitting at 91% currently right now, to come out on top against Minnesota. And granted, the injuries with Anthony Edwards definitely didn't make things easier, but it's not like Wembanyama was completely healthy either, which I think is why you're seeing this Tetris-y kind of look, at least in these blocks with these two teams going up and down. But in terms of how it sits right now, San Antonio looking like the clear-cut favorite to win the series at 91%. $100 trade pays out to $108.09 if San Antonio wins the series. If you're feeling a little bit dangerous, Minnesota trading at a 9% to win the series. That would pay a $100 payout for both of those, by the way. The one with the Spurs would pay out to that $108 amount I just said. Minnesota will pay out to $1,044.57 if correct. And they do, in fact, win the series, getting the next 2 games over San Antonio, which I think is, quite honestly, at this point, pretty unlikely. What I thought was more interesting was looking at the race to win the Western Conference. Obviously, that darker navy blue line on your screen right there. Minnesota's technically not eliminated right now at the time I'm recording this episode, so they're cut off on your screen here, but they have a 2% chance currently to take the Western Conference championships in terms of where everything stands right now, at least according to this trade on Kalshi. And I think it's extremely funny because at least this dates back all the way to this summer, where it looked like actually all the way back in July, San Antonio had a significantly lower percent chance to take the Western Conference championships. OKC sitting at 40% in July, while the Spurs were sitting at, I believe, 3.9 or right around 3%. Versus Minnesota in July was sitting at 8%. So the 2% they're sitting at now isn't necessarily so far off from that. But the Spurs have shot up over the course of this season, becoming the second clear-cut favorites to win the Western Conference pretty much since the beginning of the year. Especially when you look at, January, OKC really spiking. I mean, San Antonio ultimately right now has a 30% chance to, at least in terms of this trade, win the Western Conference Finals. But that really, the first time we see the Spurs dip over Minnesota wasn't until December, when they were both sitting at around 5% on the 11th, and then by the 14th, that's changed with Minnesota dipping back down into that 2% ballpark, while the Spurs are stayed comfortable at around that 6%. They really had a major increase around March, when they went from, I believe, 13%, give or take, right around that ballpark, over to like 22%, all within the span of March. So interesting to kind of dive into these, at least in terms of my pick for a trade for who is going to win the series between San Antonio and Minnesota. I'm selecting San Antonio. In terms of who is going to be crowned the Western Conference champion, I'm going with OKC on that. So it'll be interesting to see how it all pans out. But regardless, do not forget to use our promo code right here on the screen. I'm pointing in the wrong direction. FanArc Basketball. When you go ahead and use that code, you can you can get $10 when you trade 10. So don't forget to use that promo code, KALSHI, Kalshi, trade on anything. Now, the biggest thing with Donovan Mitchell, why I would say he's an interesting whale, per se, to go after for Miami, is he's a top 10 offensive player in the league. I mean, when you look at his last 4 seasons, my man has been absolutely filthy in terms of his efficiency and what he's been able to do. When you look at the net on-off rating, so it's at plus 5.7 for when Mitchell's on the floor compared to when he's off. And then the offensive rating, on-off rating, sitting at a plus 6.7. So in terms of his offensive rating, his advanced offensive ratings, team's exponentially better when he's on the floor. And yes, he's taking a ridiculous amount of shots, in my opinion. But I mean, he hasn't scored less than 24 points a game on average over the last 4 seasons, and he hasn't played less than 55 games in each of those 4 seasons. Now, in 3 out of 4 of those seasons, he's played in at least 68 games or more. So you're getting a top 10 offensive player that actually plays. Not trying to throw subs at Hero or Powell there, but that's the biggest strife with them. They don't freaking play. At least Donovan Mitchell is playing so he can win the awards at the end of the year, hitting that 65 game threshold consistently. And then when you look at the numbers he's put up in the playoffs, personally, and this is just, I feel like a little bit of my own bias, I would say he's a little bit of a choke artist in the postseason, given what happened with the Pacers and him not really ever being able to get it done in the West. But again, that was the West, and he basically was leading Utah with an iron fist, and Rudy Gobert was no help at all offensively while he was there. So, but anyway, going back to his playoff numbers, guy's been averaging 28 points per game in the freaking playoffs. He's a stud, at least in terms of putting the ball in the basket. I mean, he's still shooting the ball 44% in the postseason compared to, on average, what he was shooting in the regular season over the last 4 years, 48, 44, 46, 48. So right there in terms of consistency. I mean, I just think he takes a ton of shots, and ultimately that's what is like does him in a lot of the time. But to say that you can't disagree with that he's at least a top 10 offensive player in the NBA, and he, in my opinion, would be an upgrade from Hero or Powell because he actually plays a higher volume of games and can stay healthy in comparison to those guys. And in terms of defensively, what that rating looks like, negative 0.7. I mean, it's not great to be negative in that plus minus, but it's nothing unbelievably crazy. I don't necessarily believe we would be looking at worse of a defensive liability if you went ahead and go and trade for Mitchell. In addition to that, who knows what will happen with the player option? I think realistically, he will end up taking the extension this summer because we've talked about potentially, or I've at least talked about here what that scenario would look like in some way, shape, or form on the channel here at one point. But I think that he's an unrestricted free agent, not this upcoming season, but the following season. So if he doesn't go with the extension this summer, Cleveland might try to see what they can get out of him, as I had mentioned before, based on what Jake Fisher said. That might make sense to do, but because of Mitchell's love for Cleveland, that's at least what I've gathered, that Mitchell is a fan of the area, a fan of Cleveland, a fan of playing there, and doesn't seem like he wants to take his talents elsewhere. If that is the case, could be not a possibility to see Mitchell in Miami, which I don't think is completely out of the ordinary. But in terms of what the deal is going to look like, Bleacher Report cooked up a package sending Hero, Jaquez, Yakuchones, and multiple first-round picks to Cleveland in exchange for just Mitchell. We're going to be talking about this trade package here on this new What's the Deal segment that I'm trying to coin here. It's just going to be talking about potential trade packages we're looking at here over on the channel, what we ultimately think, and then ultimately ending it with what you guys have to say. Asking you guys if you agree with this trade, if you'd like to see it happen, or if you think it's god-awful, what you would rather see instead. So here on the first What's the Deal segment, we're going to be talking about this trade package from Bleacher Report involving Donovan Mitchell going to Miami, as I had just mentioned. Package includes, I'm going to sum up the picks here more. I talked about the players, and you can obviously see them on your screen. Mitchell going to Miami for Hero, Jaquez Jr., Yakuchones, the 13th pick in this year's draft, and the 2032 first-round pick Miami has as well. If you could find a way to not include that pick in this year's draft, and maybe flip it with a future first round pick either before 2030 or another one after 2030, I would like this deal a little bit more. I definitely think it's a major upgrade from Tyler Hero. As I had mentioned in the previous block, you're getting a more efficient player offensively that arguably I think would have better chemistry with Miami's best player, Bam Adebayo. And defensively, now I'm not trying to say that Donovan Mitchell is a beast on both sides of the basket and he's a two-way G, but I just in terms of the offensive upgrade and not being, I would say, as much as a defensive liability, you're upgrading on both sides of the ball from Hero in that regard. In addition, I also like that there are other players involved, but I don't like the players that are involved, but I think if you seriously want to make something like that happen, you've got to have at least 3 players in that deal, and I kind of like that that's how the package is structured a little bit. Personally, if I could flip anybody, I'd flip Jaquez for Wiggins in that deal. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world that it's Jaquez over Wiggins, but I do like the value that Jaquez adds to Miami's roster more than Wiggins. With Jaime being a younger player, having a major, really expanding his game over the course of this season versus Wiggins, definitely a veteran, older type of player. So there's definitely more room for Jaquez, I think, to continue playing at that level, if not potentially better. And then Yaku Chonez, potentially the starting point guard for this franchise, hopefully in the coming seasons, would not want to see him included in a deal. I don't think Cleveland would bite if they flipped Jovic in that, but would love to see that instead. And personally would rather include literally any other guard with the exception of Davion Mitchell in that deal, because Miami still needs a freaking point guard. And if you're not going to use your 13th overall pick to take one in this year's draft, you've got to hang on to really Davion Mitchell and Kasper Siakam, in my opinion, the only 2 point guards that either can start or have the potential to start in the future. So personally, in terms of where this package ranks, I would rate it a 6.5 out of 10 because I think it is a good deal that upgrades Miami's roster. I just don't like some of the additional pieces that they are including in that package. And if they could maybe rework some of the picks and the players, I think everything is there. Now, would Cleveland bite on that? I don't know about that, but drop in the comments what you guys think. If you think this would be a good deal for Miami, or if this would potentially be sucking them dry of assets and it wouldn't really be much of an upgrade on the offensive front. That's going to do it for this What's the Deal segment here and this Thursday's episode of your Heat Latest on FanArc. Don't forget to drop a like on this video. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube. We're chasing 700 subs, so I'd really appreciate your support over there as well. We're also on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify, so if you want to give us a listen there, would greatly appreciate your support on those platforms as well. Once again, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Sam Shapiro. Hope you guys have an awesome Thursday.